it's not only Big Law. Many careers, many professions, many Rabbanim who are in Rabbanus are working incredibly long hours and are not home with their families as much as they would like to be. And they're clay kodesh. So like, no matter what you do, if you're pursuing it in an effort to achieve and to succeed and to accomplish, then you end up being all in.
I want to be in Big Law. I want everything around that, but to still slow down a little bit on the hours.
So I said the answer to that is generally no. The Chafetz Chaim said every day he opened the store until he made enough money for that day, and then he would close. Yeah, people kept coming to his store because he was the Chafetz Chaim. But if you go to Stop and Shop on a regular Wednesday and they just closed every third Wednesday because someone made enough money that day, people are going to stop coming to your store. Normal people can't function that way.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shark Tank, the podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. Before we jump in, a quick personal request to please hit that subscribe button and leave a 5-star review. It really helps us grow the show and reach new listeners. Now, last week, we spoke with Rav Yehuda Halpert about what it means to be a Big Law lawyer while also being a Ben Torah. This week, we're back with Rav Yehuda to talk about this topic a little more. We received so much interesting feedback that we felt that it was important to address some of the concerns that listeners raised. I really appreciate everyone who reached out to say they loved what Rabbi Halpert had to say. Some of the people who said they were really bothered. So let's get into it. One of the things that people asked about was your personal decision. You framed it as a sort of values-based decision to not go all in to Big Law, to be able to focus on other areas as well. So tell us a little bit more about what that looks like. What were some of the big trade-offs and how did that go down on a practical level where you were making decisions that said my Big Law career is important, but not the most important thing in my life?
Right. So, it's, first of all, these decisions were made not last week or a few months ago, they're a few years ago. So query how time and kind of hindsight colors any of these conversations and analysis. But I don't want to overstate my value-driven decisions. I think there always, in every decision, there are multiple things going on. And there were two aspects. One was, looking for kind of what are you trying to accomplish? And the second thing is, are you happy where you are? Had I been 100% enthusiastic or even 80% enthusiastic in terms of what I was doing from a legal perspective, would I necessarily have pivoted? Maybe yes, maybe no. So I think it's a confluence of events. I definitely had this netiya, this interest in doing other things. And B, I certainly was not finding a kind of a full sifuk nefesh in terms of the type of work that I was doing. So I don't want to pat myself on the back too much in terms of that. I think it's always a combination of multiple factors. But looking back at that point in time, I think kind of you have to make certain decisions. And the decision is, do you think that you can continue on in your legal career at a big firm and accomplish these multiple goals? Or do you think you need to pivot and go in-house? Do you think you need to pivot and go work for the government? Do you think you need to pivot and move away from law altogether? Or do you think that even within Big Law, you can kind of carve out a space and a type of practice where you can do these multiple things? And I think that's actually not a bad segue. You had sent me some of the comments in advance. So folks were thinking about we're asking about the differences between years 1 through 3 versus years 3 through 5 and 3 through 6, 3 through 7. And I feel like in years 1 through 3, in my experience, and this was what I was talking about, kind of the conveyor belt or the machine of Big Law. In years 1 through 3, there's really not a lot of flexibility. You might have flexibility in terms of which departments you're in and what type of work you're doing to a small extent, but pretty much you don't have a lot of control over your career. In years 3, 4, 5, that's when you start to begin to, I wouldn't say specialize, because after 3 years, you're not really specializing, but at least you're beginning to target or direct your career in a certain direction. You're beginning to get phone calls from headhunters, and you're beginning to think about, do you want to stay at the firm? Do you want to go in-house? You have friends and colleagues who perhaps have gone in-house or have left Big Law already, and you begin to see more of a landscape. And that's when you start to be able to make a few more decisions and make more personal decisions. Year 1 through 3, it's you show up, you're there, you come to work, you do what they tell you to do. I mean, again, maybe you've chosen which department you're in, but after that, you don't have a ton of flexibility. As you get a little bit more senior, you're able to direct things a little bit more.
And one of the things that people asked about was you mentioned like there are other sort of parts of law that you can go into, but the first 3 years are different. So are those first 3 years like an investment that can pay off in time and flexibility and opportunities down the line? And I guess what are the keys to, if that is the case, to keeping your head on straight, that you're able to make clear-headed decisions and not lose yourself in those 3 difficult years when you're very, very junior?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. A lot of people view it as you said, as an investment. I mean, moving outside of our world a little, I'd say it's actually quite common for folks who are living who are from outside the tri-state area to come to a big law school, go to a good law school, get a position at a big law firm, work for the 2 to 3 years, pay off their loans with the total expectation and desire to immediately, once they've paid off their loans, leave big law, go back to different areas in the United States where, again, you could work at a very respectable and very high quality law firm, but it's not in New York, it's not in Chicago, it's not in LA, and the whole life work balance, it's just a whole different thing. So that is definitely a path for many of the lawyers that you will start with in your first year as a lawyer. The financial construct of kind of remaining orthodox in the United States and how that impacts the career decisions that people are making and the trade-offs that they're making from a financial perspective, I think really, limits a lot of people in terms of their ability to take that what seems like a very comfortable path, which is you invest these 3 years, you pay off your loans, and then you kind of exit stage left. So, I think that does have, you can really view it as an investment, similar to like if you're going into medical school, you know that you're going to do your residency and you're going to be doing 36-hour shifts straight, and you're going to be in the hospital and you're going to be on call, et cetera, et cetera. And people generally assume that after they do that residency for a few years, and maybe they do a fellowship, or maybe they do another year or two, at some point their life is going to normalize. I think what caused you to pause in the area of big law is that as you continue to get more senior, it could actually get, quote unquote, worse. Maybe not in terms of your total hours, but just in terms of your need to be available at nights and on weekends, etc. So that's always a question in terms of whether you're making an investment into something different or whether this is actually a life choice that you're going to be on this path for a while.
I really like that comparison to medical school. I think it's very spot on. As far as your own personal path, you didn't decide to leave after 3 years. You did stay in big law. So you could tell us a little bit more about what that looked like and how you positioned yourself, made certain decisions around your values in big law long term?
Yeah. So in terms of the different types of law that I was practicing, I was a general tax attorney, and therefore I was having exposure to mergers and acquisitions and to bankruptcy law and to capital markets and a little bit of everything. So at some point I did try to pivot and did try to specialize a little bit more in private equity, in the private equity space, which is a more confined. Every area of law has different challenges and different pressures in terms of responsiveness and time commitment, et cetera. But private equity, at least when I started, and the fund space generally, was a little bit more conducive to a family lifestyle, in the sense that you don't usually, although I will say that actually an email came in this morning that I'm dealing with, but you don't usually get urgent at Friday night at 10 p.m. in the private equity space on the sponsor side, because it's a much more organized and long-term project, as opposed to if you're in capital markets or if you're in M&A and like a deal just comes out, then all of a sudden you have to stop at a dime, you have to turn, you have to pivot, and that's what it is. So that was one of the big decisions that I'll say that I made, or that I tried to push for, to work in a particular area that was more conducive to the life I was trying to build.
And you, I think you alluded to in our last conversation about the financial implications, and even already today you sort of hinted at it. But can you tell us a little bit more about, for yourself, sort of what those conversations were like? Did you have to sort of make a decision that you're not necessarily going to max the earning potential within your career because of certain decisions to not work the max amount of hours or the most intense types of jobs, or be on all the right tracks? I'm not holding all these exactly, what the difference between a partner track and non-partner track, but was that something hard for you, or something that you had to negotiate?
Yeah. Well, look, financially, some decisions are decisions you make. Some decisions are decisions that are made for you. And sometimes you're either happy or upset at the time. And sometimes in retrospect, you look back and you say, wow, I was, at the time I was really angry that I didn't get that promotion, or I wasn't able to continue on this track. And you're very frustrated. But then in retrospect, you look back and you say, hey, maybe that actually was a good thing, kind of like a Gamzu Latova perspective. From a financial perspective, you're always making these decisions. If you're going to go in-house, there are certain financial benefits and there are certain financial detriments. If you're going to go work for the government, you'll have a lot of time in the evenings and on the weekends, but obviously there's going to be significant financial cutbacks. And I don't think that's unique to law. I think that's in every profession. Kohelet says, "Ohev kesef lo," one who loves and runs after money will always be running and loving. Will never have enough. Will never have sufficient cash. So I think, again, having nothing to do with law, this is just my own personal opinion. I think it's important for people to budget and think realistically about what it is that they quote unquote need in order to raise their family in a quote unquote in a comfortable and a respectable fashion, but at the same time realizing what the trade-offs are. And people, all walks of life and in all areas make those decisions all the time in terms of whether you have the decision whether to have a one-family income or a two-family income. And, if you're going to have a two-family income, then what is that going to look like, in terms of hopefully childcare and family and other decisions. So these are all in the balance. There's no one right answer. And going back to the difference between years 3, 4, and 5 and years 1 through 3, I think in years 1 through 3, there are less questions. You kind of like, this is what it is. You've signed up for it. You know what it's going to be. And you just get through it. And then after year 3, then you start to begin where you start to have more choices. You start to begin to analyze and make these decisions. Because as soon as you have choices is a luxury, but as soon as you have choices, then you can start to make different decisions. When you have no choices, then the decisions are simple. So yeah, and again, I was talking to a colleague of mine who pointed out that sometimes big law gets a bad reputation in terms of the money, the hours. And you can go into many different professions in today's day and age and have all of these exact same conflicts, but if you're not a partner in a big law firm, so people don't see that you're not getting home till 10, 11 o'clock at night, or you open up your own small practice and all of a sudden now you're working for yourself. And what are you doing? You're constantly, working for your clients, and you end up working 18, 19 hours a day, but you're not in the big law firm, but you're just working for yourself. Or, there are many other areas where you're making these exact same decisions. I think just in big law, it's very stark. It's very stark, and it's historically been known as a very hours intensive. I think the whole billable hour model points to that, because people are saying like you're getting paid for the hours that you work, so therefore exactly the whole billing in 6-minute intervals, which is part of big law, kind of puts this premium on the time that you're spending. But I will mention that even in big law, there has been a slight move away from billable hours versus different types of fee arrangements, but still that billable hours and kind of the total hours that you work and keeping track of your hours is absolutely a significant, and if not crucial part of the big law atmosphere.
And I guess one thing which I don't think that you touched on, I just want to clarify because I think it's important, and I think people were interested in this, is there such a thing as being in big law and sort of limiting your hours? Like, is there a bit of a conversation in big law about the concepts of work-life balance? And were you able to say at certain points, besides for, I guess, Shabbos, which is its own sort of conversation, but like to say, like, I want to be in big law, I want everything around that, but to still slow down a little bit on the hours?
So I said the answer to that is generally no. There's a formula and there's a path, and you're within that path. But as with everything in life, there are exceptions, and there's always questions in terms of if you, first of all, depending on what type of work you're doing and the situation and the circumstance, if you put yourself in a situation where your contributions are unique and crucial, then as you get more senior, you might have more leverage, and then you might have the ability to negotiate. If you don't put yourself, sometimes it's impossible to be put in that situation. Sometimes the answer is, well, look, there are 10 other people who can do exactly what you're doing, and they will have no restrictions on their time. And honestly, what kind of people talk about Sabbath observance and being Shomer Shabbos in the firm, that's, again, you absolutely can be Shomer Shabbos in the firm, but you have to realize that when you're competing against people who can work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. If they want to, you can work 6 days a week, 24 hours a day. You need to convince your employees and your colleagues that you can do just as good a job 6 days a week, 24 hours a day as the other person can do 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Sometimes you can do it. Sometimes you can't. There are certain areas in law where not being available Saturday morning just is not an option. And it's not a question of anti-Semitism or discrimination or anything. It's like, you just can't do the job. Like, you can't play center field for the New York Yankees if you're not going to play on Saturday. So if you're a staff observer, you can't be center field. You could pitch. You could be a reliever. You could be a lefty reliever out of the bullpen because they don't always need you on Saturday. And again, that's also like, so in years 1 through 3, you face that as well. But in years 1 through 3, there are many more. Everyone's kind of interchangeable. So it's very rare that somebody says, we desperately need Halpert Friday night at 11 p.m. Like that doesn't happen, because there are 20 other lawyers who can pretty much do what you're doing. Now, again, you have to be respectful and realize that if you're not available Friday night at 10 o'clock, there's some other lawyer who's working Friday night at 10 o'clock, and you need to thank them, and you need to appreciate that they covered for you, and you need to offer to cover for them on Thanksgiving or Christmas or on Sunday or Saturday night when you come back online. But there's there's some things that you just can't do. And kind of the same thing goes to this hours and, flexibility, et cetera. If you make yourself a valuable commodity, then you have the ability to negotiate. And sometimes you win those negotiations. Sometimes you lose those negotiations. I know people who say, look, for family reasons, there are a lot of people who want to go part-time because they're raising kids or they have family, and when they come into the office, they're like, I want to go part-time. And the answer is no. So you say, well, if you don't let me go part-time, I'm going to leave. And they'll say, okay, you have to leave, but we don't need someone who's part-time. So that's again, I wouldn't say that you're in year 3 and year 4, but as you get more senior and you have defined your career and what you can do, what you can't do, then there's ability to negotiate. You're not always going to win those negotiations. And also you might win those negotiations on day 1, and then 2 years later, the world has changed, the climate has changed, the business environment has changed, and now it's not always possible. So it's a constant struggle. And again, I don't think that's unique to Big Law. I think that's in every profession, even the management consulting and investment banking and like the big names, but in many other professions as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning the teammates picking up for you on Friday night and Shabbos, because that is actually a point that someone reached out to highlight as well and to be aware of. So thank you for mentioning that. As far as your position as a Shabbos rabbi, it's obviously very convenient because it's the one day that you're not doing Big Law. You're able to do that. What would you say might have happened if you hadn't found that position, that stellar? Or alternatively, if someone is listening to this and they want to be involved in Marbitz Torah, in having a sort of a Marbitz Torah identity along with their Big Law, but they don't necessarily have that official position available being offered to them, what would your advice be to them?
It's a really good question. It's a really important question. I think that there are many different opportunities and places where you can carve out for yourself an opportunity to be involved in Marbitz Torah and education and teaching. There are people, first of all, just even if you're not the Rav on Shabbos, there are many people who give a shiur once a week on Shabbos after Hashkama, before the main minyan, before Mincha, and to whatever situation or location you're in, to approach the folks in that shul or approach the rabbi and say, hey, I would love to be able to do something. As soon as once the greatest form of learning or that you know something, the best is when you're able to teach it to other people. So forcing yourself to be a Maggid Shiur really puts a responsibility on you, requires you to prioritize that, and really creates a construct where you're constantly involved in that and thinking about that. Whether it's, whether you're an assistant rabbi or a rabbi or some official position, or you just take on to give a shiur, that's a great opportunity. And usually those things can grow. So like if you give one shiur and it's going very well, then it's possible people come to you and say, hey, you're doing this on Shabbos, anyway, you could do this on Sunday. And I think you do something during the week. So also opportunities in the city. There are people who do like lunch and learns, and there are, as I mentioned, there are people who do daf yomi, and there are all sorts of different places to do daf yomi. So nowadays you can go online and you can listen to the greatest Maggidei shiur of daf yomi. It's available, but that's very different than you teaming up with a group of 3, 4, 5 people, and this is your daf yomi shiur, and then you each take a turn, and then that's how you really engage yourself. And is your Daf Yomi share going to be as good as one of the ones on the the OU website or Rabbi Rosner or some of these other great Daf Yomi shares that have thousands of listeners? Probably not, but that doesn't mean that for you personally, in terms of your connection to Torah and teaching, it's more valuable. And if you're able to create that, so it's really all about carving out different spaces and different areas. There are some people who don't are not they don't give shir, they don't like giving shir, but they write, and you can write articles, and you can write. There's so many Torah journals now out there that are always looking for quality content, and that's something that you can do really on your own on your own time. Because if you're giving a shir and you're committing to something, then that's a fixed time. But if you're just writing, then you have an hour or two, you're waiting for documents or something, or on a Sunday night or whatever, you can just write. And then if something comes up and you can't write that night, so then you switch and you're able to write a different night. So writing articles and writing in journals and that type of learning also is something very powerful that you can do. Before I actually became the rabbi in Avas Shalom, I was doing some continuing education in on some local college campuses and within the community, and kind of at the JCC there. So there are many different opportunities that if you're searching for it, and if you're not going to demand significant compensation for your services, you can find yourself different ways to stay involved in Torah. And I do think that that's a very important way to maintain your sense of self and your priorities, is being involved in learning and teaching in that way. It kind of keeps you very grounded, and having that obligation and that responsibility. So that's the advantage of the shiurim or chabura over just writing articles, because if you're just writing, then there's nothing holding your feet to the fire, and there's no one who tells you the next morning, oh, you weren't at shiur yesterday. But if you're engaged in a group and in a chevra and something like that, then that's very significant.
Amazing. And for you, practically, I'm wondering how you handle your Shabbos rabbi duties on two levels. Number one, how do you make the time during the week to prepare whatever you need to prepare for whatever you're teaching that Shabbos? And also, how do you make sure that you don't arrive at Shabbos drained and wiped and completely zonked and just want to, you're on duty, you're working, you need to be presentable and presenting and bring a certain energy, and you can't just be a shmata when Shabbos comes around. So I'm wondering how you handle those two things.
Well, there are two assumptions in that question. The assumption is A, I have time to prepare, and B, that I don't come up to Shabbos as a shmata. I'm not sure either of those are always the case. Again, it really different. And I also, it's not necessarily unique to me. I think a lot of pulpit rabbis have other careers during the week. Oftentimes it's usually linked to teaching in a high school or an elementary school and kind of teaching in the Torah world. But pulpit rabbis have tremendous responsibilities and obligations, also pastoral care during the week as well. So it's always everyone you have to carve out time. I think Thursday night for me personally is a very good time. I have to say that I've generally, going back to when I first started as a lawyer, Fridays, especially in the winter, were always incredibly stressful. And my approach was always, come Thursday night, I wanted my entire desk clear, so that if anything came in on Friday, I'd be able to jump on it and at least minimize the stress of Shabbos. So as opposed to saying, okay, look, I know this is going to take me 2 hours. I have 2 hours Friday morning, and then something else comes in, and now you've got 8 hours of work on Friday. So because of that, Thursday night was always a late night, and therefore it was, and then you're already close to Shabbos, kind of things you're thinking about things during the week. So Thursday night for me is always a very late night, and that's usually a time that I try to get stuff in. In terms of being able to quote unquote show up, I think one of the reasons why, I get a lot of, I'm not saying it's not hard and it doesn't take a lot of effort and energy, but I also get a lot of a sense of accomplishment and as you say, sipuk nefesh, and kind of a positive feeling out of what I do on Shabbos. So even if you're tired, even if you're fatigued, this is what I say, kind of, if you love what you do, then it's not work. So for them, I won't say I love every aspect of it, but if on Shabbos, usually I'm there because I want to be there. So therefore, it's easier to get yourself up for it. If you haven't slept in 3 days, you haven't slept in 3 days. It doesn't matter how excited you are about it. So that's for me, that's a big thing.
Got it. And you mentioned the late nights and how that affects things. So I do want to read a message I got from my dear friend David, who's a big law lawyer early in his career, very busy. And I appreciate the fact that he took the time to listen to the episode and give some feedback. So I want to read to you his message. He wrote as follows: His description of Big Law was missing what I think is its defining feature vis-a-vis any other pursuit, which is that there is no end time, especially as a junior associate. You are expected to be on almost all the time and are always expected to complete assignments at any time when they are deemed urgent. So I agree that scheduling chavrusas and the like in the morning is probably more likely to work than at night, but the morning is almost equally as unlikely when you end up having to go to sleep at 2:33 and beyond.
I can't argue with that. I think that's true. Going back to the distinction between big law versus other professions at the moment, post-COVID and the work from home revolution, which is beginning to recede slightly in the United States, many other professions got the benefits, or I'll say maybe the detriments of this idea of never being off. Like, work doesn't end. You're always available. You're always on. You're always around. I do agree that in big law, it is slightly different. In many professions, if someone sends you an email at 11:30 at night and you don't get to it till the morning, it's like, it was 11:30 at night. And depending on which areas of the law firm you're in, it's very possible that people will say, you get an email at 11:30 and at 12:15 you haven't responded, and people are like, hey, what's going on? How come you didn't respond yet? So there's no doubt that type of havoc on your schedule it can crush you. I think that's actually one of the biggest reasons why a lot of people leave big laws, because you just, that complete lack of control over your schedule. As you get more senior, you do get a little bit more control over those types of things. Not always, because if the client calls, but at least you're higher up in the pecking order in terms of knowing when things are coming down the pike and when things are going to have to get done. When you're a first, second, or third year associate, you are the last person to know. And by the time you find out, there is no flexibility anymore. It's like, this needs to be done now. But that's also we go talking about, daf yomi in the morning, chavrusas, the other things. Sometimes when you're a junior associate, the flip side of that is that if no one's giving you any work, there's nothing for you to do. Now, they always say to you, okay, you should be reading and advancing your career and doing these other things. But as you get more senior, there's lots of non-legal work. There's billing, and there's client development, and there's article writing, and there's all sorts of different stuff. So like, even when you're not quote unquote busy, you're always busy. When you're more junior, it's like, if you don't have anything to do, you don't have anything to do. So if you have like a seder, or if you have a chavrusa, who might also be in big law, it's possible that like at 2:00 in the afternoon, there's just nothing going on, and you can learn then. And then of course, when the email comes in at 8:00 at night, and now you're in the office from 8 to 11, you've gotten that time in. But it's a very fair point, and it's true. It's absolutely true. But again, like when you go back to the investment point, so some people say like, well, just dead stop there. Like, that's it. I can never pursue this career because there's going to be a period in time when I have no control over my schedule, and all my chavrusas are going to be ruined, and all my zmanim are going to be wrong. But if you view it as more of a investment, and you say, listen, for these certain number of years, this is what I'm going to be subject to. And that's going to allow me to do all sorts of different things later on in my career, than just like the doctor who's in the hospital, or the professor who's writing a PhD who has to be totally engrossed, or if you're doing scientific experiments in the lab and you have to be in the lab, etc. If you view it that way, then it's a totally different analysis. And then when that investment is over, you come to year 3, year 4, year 5, and you say to yourself, okay, can I get control over this situation? Will it be like this forever? Is there a way that I can begin to navigate within this so that I get some sense of stability? And sometimes the answer is no. And some people say, okay, I'm going to do it anyway. And some other people say, look, that's it. I gotta get out. So I think that comment is completely on point. It's a very fair comment. But that is one way that I think you can try to at least deal with it a little, is to create space when you're not busy, to always have something going on that you can turn to and say, okay, look, I missed my morning chavrusa, or I missed my night chavrusa, I missed this, I missed that, but now I've got 40 minutes in the afternoon where things are slow, and you're able to do that.
Got it. So I want to read maybe the harshest message that came in. Some of the things here we've touched on and addressed, but let's see what else we want to unpack from here. Goes as follows from a listener in Yerushalayim who asked that I leave his name out of the episode. Still trying to process the episode, but I felt parts of it were quite disturbing. The idea that these huge costs, some of which were discussed, some of which aren't, are worth paying to have a career like this. For what exactly? To me, the trade-offs were massively understated, and I was hoping to probe more. The emotional costs, the physical costs, the costs to our children, the spiritual costs, not just in terms of whether you're shomer Torah mitzvos, but the opportunity costs of living a different life. The story about the twins was so tragic, but it wasn't discussed as a tragic story. It was brought to say that different parts of your life require different things. It's tragic that the story isn't tragic.
I agree 100% that was the harshest feedback that I saw. harsh. I don't think it was meant to be mean, but certainly cutting. There are fundamental hashkafic questions in terms of what a person is going to do with their time, what a person is going to do with their life. And there are people who are far more qualified out of a range of qualities to address those issues. So if you're going to say in a vacuum, look, should I go sit in Kollel and learn all day, or should I go into Big Law? Okay, that is a fork in the road, right? And you are never going to accomplish in learning in Big Law what you will accomplish if you go sit in Kollel. Those are just forks. Once you have made a decision to pursue a career, then the question is, how do you pursue that career? So we have a concept of the kifshuha, that you need to, that part about man's obligation is to conquer and to use your abilities to the best of your abilities to accomplish as much as you can accomplish. What does the word accomplish mean? Accomplish means different things to different people. Sometimes the only way, it'd be great if you could accomplish everything from 9 to 5 and then just shut your phone off and shut everything off and then just go do other things. Many areas, and it's not only Big Law, many careers, many professions, many Rabbanim who are in Rabbanus are working incredibly long hours and are not home with their families as much as they would like to be. And they're clay kodesh. They're in this world. So like, no matter what you do, if you're pursuing it in an effort to achieve and to succeed and to accomplish and to HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you certain qualities and certain opportunities and abilities, and you feel you have an obligation to use those to the best of your abilities, then then you end up being all in. It doesn't matter. Now you might ask, is it better to be all in as a doctor? Because all in as a doctor, you're saving lives, as opposed to, is it better to be all in as a DNA geneticist, because you're involved in all these, super important things, saving lives? As a lawyer, what are you doing? If you're just making money, you're just doing this. So those are important questions for every aspect of your career. Do you feel that your career is defined simply by how much money you're making, or are there Yishuv HaOlam concepts to what you're doing? You are succeeding in the workplace. You are enabling markets to continue to function. You are allowing transactions to take place. You are being Mekadeshem Shemayim at the highest levels of your profession. Again, going back to those hashkafic questions, some people view those as very laudable goals. I fall into that category. Other people, and perhaps this questioner as well, say, I don't really ascribe any value to that at all. Why not just get a job where you can, go to the office 9 to 5, sit there and push paper, and then so long as you have enough money to buy bread and peanut butter, you're good to go. So again, those are important questions that should be asked. I don't think they're unique to Big Law. I think those questions apply to all the place. In terms of the story being tragic, here I do strongly disagree with the comment. I don't find that story to be tragic at all, and I would not present it in a tragic fashion. And the fact that I don't find it to be tragic, I don't find to be tragic. Anyone who thinks that at different points in their lives they don't have different tafkidim and they don't have different responsibilities and different priorities is living in La La Land. Now, again, you might not be happy with the fact that this individual is spending so much time at Goldman Sachs and therefore didn't have time for these other things. But the idea that at different stages in your life, like your obligations and responsibilities as a yeshiva bacher are completely different than your obligations as a koloman, which are completely different than your obligations when you are a grandparent, which are completely different than your obligations when you are whatever. At every stage in life, you need to be reassessing what you should be doing with your time and what are your obligations. And putting food on the table and caring for your children is a primary obligation at that stage in your life. And if that means that at that stage in your life, you're not going to spend as much time learning, or, you say the chiyuv is to be conveyor itim l'Torah, right? And you're makayim that by saying Kriya Shema in the morning, Kriya Shema in the evening, right? Now, I'm not advocating that, but to say that it's tragic when somebody has twins and has a career and is trying to balance all these things, and that to say that's tragic, I think that's a very immature, and again, I'm sure, no doubt that the individual who made the comment is thinking about it from a different perspective, but it just seems to me to be a very, a very immature way to look at the world, that there are not different obligations on you at different times. You can argue what those obligations are, but to say that your obligations from your bar mitzvah until the day you die are the same I don't agree with that at all.
I guess the question was there's no obligation to be at Goldman Sachs. That's the question, right? There are obligations to feed your family, like that sort of, which when we talked about it, you originally even did allude to it a little bit. And then the question then becomes like, is that really justified? There are other ways to make a parnasa that are decent and honest and use your skills that are not that. So can't we pull that back one step to get a little bit of room to breathe in your life without foregoing the other values?
Right. So, again, that goes back to a more of a hashkafic conversation, which is if if person X could be a nuclear physicist, which would take 18 hours a day, and they could also get, a government job at the Department of Motor Vehicles. I don't mean to denigrate, but let's take that as a trope, and clock in at 9 and clock out at 5, and therefore have more time for learning and more time for these other things. Which, is it better to work at the DMV because then you'll have all these Siddharim that are Kabua, etc.? So again, I will let people who are greater than me give you advice on those issues. But the world that my Reveim and the world that I come from, I think does put a premium on the kifshua and using your abilities to the greatest possibility. And unfortunately, if a person wants to really be successful in many of these careers, you can't do it 40% or 45%, right? Rav Yehuda Halpert's son would, when he clerked at the Supreme Court, he would sleep in chambers, right? And he went on to be one of the world experts in international law. He basically created the field, and then he was a professor at Columbia for over 20 years. He was Mekadesh Shem Shemayim in a way, that many of us even dreamed that we could. He was not able to do that. If he hadn't put that time in, he would never have been able to reach that level. So you might say, okay, fine, he would have reached that level, but he would have known more Gemara and Rashi and Tosfos. Okay, again, I'll let someone else answer that question. But if your goal is to achieve at a high level and you feel that is something important, and again, you could argue, say, if you're just making more money and you're just I'm going to work. If I work 8 hours, I'll make $8. And if I work 12 hours, I'll make $12. I'm going to work 12 hours so I can get that extra $4. And it's all about the $4 because with $4 more, I can buy 4 more things and we can go on 4 more trips and I can have 4 more cars. Okay, fine. I would disagree with that priorities, but life's not that black and white. That's just a silly way to look at the world. If you want to, it's not it's very rare that you can just shut down and say, I made enough today. The Chafetz Chaim opened his store, for what they said. He said every day he opened the store until he made enough money for that day, and then he would close. Yeah, people kept coming to his store because he was the Chafetz Chaim. But if you go to Stop and Shop on a regular Wednesday and they just closed every third Wednesday because someone made enough money that day, people are going to stop coming to your store. Normal people can't function that way. So you can't say to your boss, hey, I made enough money today. I'm going home at 3:00 because I want to go, because I want to go learn more. So, I mean, these are, and again, I'm not making a value judgment as to how anyone makes that decision. Everyone needs to make that decision the way they think makes sense for them. And, in conversations, if you're a serious religious person, and you'll have deep conversations about those types of trade-offs and what's important in your life and what's important in terms of your values. Also, look, you could argue that, and I've heard many people make this argument, that again, going back to one income, two incomes, that it's very significant to have a parental figure in the home raising children on a full-time basis. And therefore, if one person, and here I'm being as politically correct as possible, could be either person, right? Either the father or the mother. If one person needs to be in the office 20 hours a day and that allows the other person to be home 20 hours a day, then maybe that's better than having 2 people working 9 to 5 jobs. And therefore, some third party is in the home from 2 to 5 o'clock every night. Now you might shoot back and say, who said you need 2 incomes? Maybe you only need one income. Okay, well, again, this goes back to kind of all these other broader conversations that I think are outside the realm of big law specific.
Okay, no, that was very helpful, and I certainly appreciate the framing of the Chafetz Chaim story. I think that's an important story that we hear in yeshiva and needs to be taken with a few grains of salt. So thank you for that. We're really close to being out of time, and I don't want to keep you longer than you have, but I would maybe want to ask for a little bit more advice, as you started to allude to, about being a husband and being a father under these circumstances where you're working such long hours. It's something that a bunch of people reached out and had a few things to say about that. So with whatever time you're remaining, I'd appreciate any more insights to how we think about these roles when, again, as far as quantity of time and quantity of energy on a regular basis is quite scarce.
So I think that's a really important question, both in terms of being a spouse as well as being a parent and balancing these different things. Again, I think one of the downsides of Big Law, which is also its upside, is that on one hand, you have to be available all the time. On the other hand, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of, most employers and most people you work with at the law firm, like they know if you're going to be there from 8 p.m. to 1 a.m., if you say to them, hey, my kid has parent teachers night from 6 to 8, I'm just going to go home from 6 to 8, then I'm going to log back on at 8 p.m. So long as the deal isn't closing at 7:15 p.m., which most of the time it's not, then you have that flexibility. So when your kids are littler, younger, smaller, there can be more flexibility there, because when you find yourself available, oftentimes your kids are available. It becomes so again, especially like, if they're not in like a set school schedule. And I mentioned before, and people have mentioned, and Big Law usually starts a little later. So maybe if you want, you get to spend quality time with your kids in the morning. Now people will say, well, if you spend the quality time with the kids in the morning, how can you also have your Siddharim in the morning? And that goes back to the Goldman Sachs story. Again, these are all things that need to be balanced. You need to balance your obligation to be mechanech your children with your obligation to have Talmud Torah, with your obligations to be a spouse, with your obligations to work. I'm not saying these are easy decisions, but there is that flexibility. Fine when your kids get older and then your kids are on a set schedule. So the fact that you have flexibility is irrelevant. So I was actually just talking about this with a friend of mine. Say, if you're single and 32, which is, I'd say, a lot of the folks in the law firm, and then you're slow for a few days. So you go do whatever you want to do. You hang out, you relax, you take the time, you go to the gym. Maybe someone says, oh, go grab a vacation for 2 days. And then the person comes back a week later, and then they work for 3 weeks straight on some crazy deal. They never leave the office. And then the day or two, then all of a sudden they get another week off like that in the middle of nowhere. And they're able to function like that. If you're home with a spouse and a family, and like the fact that you're free from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. in the afternoon is completely irrelevant, because no one else is available. And all of a sudden, like when you need to cancel a vacation, it's not like everyone can just pick up and go on vacation the next week, because they all have school. So when your kids are little, there's a lot more flexibility. When your kids are older, this is a real issue. And I think, but then when your kids are a little older, usually then you are a little bit more senior. So that's where you're able to start negotiating. And if you make yourself a valuable asset, then you are able to negotiate and explain to your employers and your colleagues, look, these are the things that are important to me: family, religion, this, that, the other thing. And because other people, you might not agree with other people's decisions, but other people have also things that are important to them. Family is a fairly universal thing, but there are some people who are, piano virtuosos, or they have a band, or they're comedians on the side. And employers, I think one positive trend that has changed since I started is that employers have realized that it's worth being a little bit more flexible to keep quality employees, as opposed to being very stringent and having everybody be 9 to 5. Then you'll have a lot of quality people who are going to leave because they're not willing to do that. So I think there is a little bit more flexibility in Big Law than there once was. But, again, sometimes it depends where and that's where I think I mentioned last thing, like, if you're working with people who are not quote unquote good people, or who don't appreciate the things that you value, when you tell them, hey, I really need to get to parent teachers conference tonight, and they say, that's dumb, why don't you just let your spouse go and you stay here and work on this? That's not a person you want to work with. Like, because if it's important, doesn't matter whether it's objectively important. You said it's important to you, and they've said, I don't care. So maybe that's a situation you want to get out of. And you can't always get out of every situation just because you're working with bad people. So I think that's an important balancing.
Okay, Rav Halpert, thank you so much for hopping on for a second straight week. It's the first time we've ever done this, but I think it was very important, and I think the listeners will gain a lot from this. It's an important topic, and as you mentioned before, it resonates with the lawyers out there, it resonates with people in other careers, because it really gets to the heart of a lot of these struggles that a lot of us are dealing with in different ways, shapes, and forms. So thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm very happy to hear that people were interested with the content and engaging with the content. And it's a little bit, I don't know, reassuring is the right word, but it's nice to see that a lot of the struggles that I went through and that I've been thinking through, that I talk about with my colleagues, these are kind of like universal struggles that everyone is having. And I don't know if there's no one right answer, but the fact that people are thinking about them and struggling about them demonstrates that they are significant issues and that we're all trying to achieve a best place, a best balance of all of these different things. So it's rewarding to hear that people are thinking about that, and that I'm able to add something to that conversation. I'm very happy about that.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly something when I started this podcast, I realized that these were big issues, and really my small contribution is to be able to have real and honest and raw conversations about them, whatever value that brings. Hopefully it brings some value. So thank you so much, and we will see you guys all next time.
All right. Thank you. Bye.